Alright guys, welcome back. Now we're going to finally start compositing our sequences. We're also going to hop back into Maya to fix some problems and then render out a couple more versions. We're also going to be later on showing you how to do bloom. So if that sounds interesting, be sure to stick around for that. Otherwise, let's get started in After Effects. Alright, so now that the rendering is done, it is time to start compositing. When you launch After Effects, the first thing to do is double click your project window and then go and select the sequences from your images folder. Double click the first folder up here, and then it doesn't really matter which file you select as long as OpenEXR sequence is checked. After Effects will figure out that this entire collection is part of a sequence, and then it will automatically import the entire sequence. However, since we have 3 of these, there is a more efficient way to do this, so I'm going to delete that. If we open up the images folder in Windows Explorer, select all 3 of these folders. As long as there aren't any subfolders within these folders, we can simply click and drag these into the images folder. All right, so if we click on the first one here, if you notice up in the data, it says it's at 30 FPS, but in Maya, we worked at 24 FPS. Which is standard for visual effects. So let's right click, go to Interpret Footage, Main, and then we're going to assume a frame rate of 24. We also need to go up to Color Management, and under Interpret as Linear Light, we need to force this to be on. What this means is by default, After Effects will only interpret a sequence as having linear light if it is a 32 bits per channel file. Now we rendered out a raw or linear image sequence, but we only did it in a 16-bit per channel format. So by default, After Effects is not going to recognize that, so we need to force it to be on. Then we can click OK. And since we have 3 of these files, we can save the settings from the first one we changed and apply it to the other ones. To do that, we right click over the first one, go to Interpret Footage again, remember interpretation, then we select the other 2. Right click again, Interpret Footage, apply interpretation. Now both of these will use the same settings. I'm going to grab this plane sequence here and click and drag it into this comp film strip icon. What this does, it makes a composition that is the same length as the sequence with the same size and frame rate. Let's magnify this by clicking this button down here and fit up to 100%. This sequence is 200 frames, but generally for visual effects, you will put a slate on your first frame. We need to increase the length of our composition by 1 frame. Now to do this, we need to be viewing frames. If you don't see a frame counter here and you only see time code like this, which is hours, minutes, seconds, frames, hold down the Control key and select, and this will switch it to frames. Next, you can right click over the title of the composition, go to Composition Settings. You can also do it in the project window, and you can also do it in the menu up here, Composition Settings, or you can use the shortcut key Control K. So for the duration, I'm just going to change this to be 201. Click OK. We're going to increase the Time Navigator end so we can view the entire composition. Click Page Down on the keyboard to go forward 1 frame, or you can just type it in here. And with the layer selected, click the left bracket key. This will snap the layer's starting position to the position of the time navigator. Do the same thing with the exhaust and the sky layers. Drag these underneath, and then again, click the left bracket key. Make sure your sky is underneath your exhaust. So right now we're looking at the master layer. As if we were to render this from the frame buffer, this is what it would look like. If you could include the exhaust in with the master layer by default, which we can't since this is using hardware 2.0 and the sky and the plane are using V-Ray. The advantage is now we can solo just the sky, the exhaust, and the plane and make adjustments to them separately. Now what we're looking at here is the beauty pass of the plane. So this is what you would look at in the frame buffer. It does not include AO, it does not include Z-depth. It includes all the other passes that we used. So the very first thing that we need to do is separate this plane into all its separate passes. But before we do that, we are going to rename this one to be the plane beauty. So click enter on the keyboard. And notice when I click enter, this changes from source name to layer name. Layer name is whatever we rename the file. Source name is what the original file name is. We're going to duplicate this layer with Control D. Unsolo these now. And the very first pass that we're going to add is the GI or global illumination layer. So we're looking for an extractor effect. So the extractor effect, if you notice, it says EXR, they're all capitalized, and this is a way of separating passes of a multi-channeled EXR file. So to do that, we're going to select anywhere in this blank space, go into layers, and here we can see all of the different passes that we specified in V-Ray. So we're going to start with GI. Notice also that the RGB values are all changed to the GI equivalent. So we have GI for R, G, and B respectively. Click OK. And now you will notice that this is looking very, very dark. So this is something that we need to do right at the very beginning, but I just wanted to show you the result because sometimes it's not evident if you make these adjustments beforehand. We need to set up our working space. So click where it says 32 BPC. This might say 8 or 16 for you. Select this. This is an absolutely vital part of compositing. You need to make sure you're using a linear workflow and you have set up the correct working space. I'll need to move the project window down here so it can fit on the screen. Select where it says none, and you want to go up here to sRGB. sRGB is the standard working space for most computers and monitors, at least Windows monitors. So this is using a gamma of 2.2, and then we need to linearize the working space. So by clicking linearize, you'll notice that the color changes. If you forget to linearize your working space and then you realize halfway through your project that you didn't do it, you will have to recomposite nearly everything because the values are very different. To view the same colors and values that we saw in Maya, we have to linearize. So before we separate out all the passes, go back up to this extractor and we need to unmultiply it. If you notice on this edge here, it gets a little bit darker when we don't unmultiply it. Now the unmultiplier effect is a way of removing the background from areas of partial transparency, or in this case, it's just motion blur. So if I were to solo this layer and select my transparency toggle, you can see that this area is a little bit transparent. If we turn this off, you'll notice that areas of the alpha channel that are not occupied by pixels by default will render as black. And because this is black, we get a really thin black edge around the plane. Sometimes it is not necessary to unmultiply, but quite often it is, so it's safer just to check mark the box. So right now we're going to duplicate these passes, just go one by one, change the extractor effect, and change the pass name. So the next pass is going to be the lighting pass. The lighting pass is going to be our direct illumination, and the blending mode for lighting is going to be additive, so we come up here to add. One more thing before we continue. If you do not see your blending modes here, there might be a toggle switches, so you can select this button to toggle between your switches, which are these, and your modes, which are your blending modes and track mats. If you'd like to see them both on the same panel, which I recommend, right click on layer name, go to columns, and then select switches and or modes, whichever one is not selected, and then both of them will be on one panel. If you have a large enough monitor, I highly recommend this. It's far more efficient than having to click a button every time. Okay, so next we can duplicate lighting, rename the next one to be reflection. This again is going to be additive. Specular, which is also additive. Refraction, which is additive. And self-illumination, which is also additive. Next we have ambient occlusion, or AO. Ambient occlusion is multiplied. And lastly, we have Z-depth. Now for Z-depth, you'll notice that if you select Z, the RGB values do not change. This is because the Z-depth channel contains no color information and it only contains a single channel. To get any non-color channel to work properly, go into each RGB channel and select the channel name. Now Z-depth is not composited with a blending mode, so we're just going to set this to be normal, and then we'll turn this layer off and use it later. Now we can unsolo all of these and have a look at the entire result. In your project folder, just go ahead and make a new folder called comps. Now, when you save version numbers, you should always save the same version number as whatever the latest render that you did in Maya. The latest render was version 2, so you should save your After Effects composition as version 2 as well. This makes it much easier to go back and forth between projects, and clients can use the version number to tell you what they liked and what they didn't like, and that same version number corresponds to a composition and also corresponds to a scene file. And if you're using After Effects and Maya consistently, going back and forth between them, make sure you always have the same version number for the comp and the Maya scene, and all your frames have the version number on them as well. Otherwise, it's very easy to forget which version corresponds with which file, and it can make your life hell to try to figure that out, especially weeks after you've worked on something and a client finally responds or something like that. Just go ahead and make sure these always are the same as your Maya scene file. Click OK. Let's set this to half resolution so this renders a little bit faster. Let's go to the very beginning and then just click the spacebar. This will load in the sequence into your PC's RAM, and then it will play in real time. Now, depending on the size and the length of your composition and how much RAM you have in your PC, you may not be able to load in the entire shot. In this case, we only have 200 frames, so we can. It'll make it a little bit easier to check what we rendered. Alright, so now this is loaded in the RAM. We can see that it is now playing at 24 FPS, and there are a few things right away that I noticed that need to be corrected. So when you load in your sequence and you get everything composited, the very first thing that you should check are all the passes being viewed correctly. So when I was compositing mine, all of them appeared to be correct. None of the passes were black. So a lot of students have this problem where their reflection and specular passes are completely black. This generally indicates that in V-Ray, you either have the amount set to 0, you have a black map placed in the reflection channel, or you have a glossiness of 1. And if you have a glossiness of 1 with no HDR image and only one object that you're rendering, it's very difficult to get reflections to show up properly. The same thing can happen with GI. So just go back through, make sure you're using an HDR image, or you have at least an environment set up. You've placed your reflection maps in the correct channel. Your maps are not black and your mounts are not at 0. Those are the easiest things to fix, but some of the most common mistakes that I see. As far as the composition goes, the nose of the plane gets very, very close to the edge. It's almost touching, so I want to fix that. I want to pull this out a little bit more. Likewise, the exhaust does not extend far enough back. And then right at the very end here, I'm noticing that the camera kind of just like hits a wall. It just seems to stop at around frame 120. It just seems to hit and then just slide. It's not very smooth, so I want to go ahead and fix that as well. Also looking at the glass here, the refraction looks a little bit too strong. It's kind of warping the image behind it a little bit too much. Glass is not going to be that thick, so we want to go back and correct that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and set up another render, and then we can come back and composite. All right, so in Maya, the very first thing I mentioned was the camera not being zoomed out far enough. So I want to go ahead and do that. So we're going to up version this file, save it version 3, select the camera, and then I'm just going to pull out just a little bit. I'm gonna set this back to 200. Also getting 2 keyframes here, so that's probably part of the problem. Pull back out a little bit. To have a closer inspection of these keyframes, we're gonna open up the graph editor. And yeah, this is a problem here. I don't like these keyframes. They seem to have 2 keyframes very close. Just gonna delete those. Move this off to the side here. Yeah, and that solves that problem. One thing that I would like to do though, I'm going to take these keyframes here, so I'm just holding down the shift key and clicking and dragging over these keyframes, moving this over to frame 200. So this is looking a little bit better. I think what I'd like to do though is around frame 160, I'm going to take this plane and maybe at around frame 120, I'll set a keyframe, go to frame 160, and then just pull up the wing, let it bank a little bit. And then by frame 200, it can go back, just so we can maybe see just a little bit underneath the wing. Select the camera again, and at frame 160, I'll just lower the angle just a tad. We're gonna have to zoom out a little bit more. And at around frame 60, we're gonna pull the camera down just to get this more in frame. Another thing that I'd like to add is a little bit of camera shake in After Effects. So pulling out this far will allow us to be able to crop back in after we add the camera shake. So I'm pretty happy with this right now. I think this will be okay. Next thing that we can do here is go into the exhaust and scale both of these exhaust objects back. So the furthest out I think we see is probably around here. So as long as I clear the canvas, we should be good. Pull these out. And we're also going to have to go into the flare with the flare handle and take the high bound back up, maybe to around 3. Otherwise it's going to bulge too soon. Something like that should be good. One more thing I'd like to do is go into perspective view here really fast. Select the pilot's head. I'm just going to add just a little bit of animation to this pilot. Will make it feel a little bit more alive. So maybe as the camera's coming down, it kind of glances up at the camera, then looks back the other way. Just a little bit of really subtle motion, but make it look a little bit more realistic. This guy, he's not doing anything important right now. He can just look up around here. He can look back. Give this guy just a little bit more movement on his head. It could look a little bit more realistic there. Something just really subtle, but something that we might notice in the final result. Okay. I also mentioned the glass had a little bit too much refraction on it. So let's go into the canopy glass, go down to the refraction IOR, and for this we're going to turn on IPR. And we're looking at some of the distortion around the edge here. And one thing you can do with IPR is a little bit more convenient than rendering the entire thing. If we select this little icon up here, it turns on the region render, then we can just click and drag a region that we'd like to focus on, and it's not going to waste time rendering anything else. And I'll try a refraction of 1.2. That looks a little bit better. If we look at from some different angles, yeah, that looks a little bit more realistic. turn off the region renderer. I just want to have a look at the overall lighting here. And one other thing that I'm noticing is I kind of want this screen left side of the plane to be a little bit brighter. And this would just allow the plane to look a little bit more visually interesting in our composite. So one thing I can do, I could go into the HDR and make it a little bit brighter, but perhaps what would be a little easier here is to just create a directional light and line it up with the sun in the HDRI. Let's go up to create lights, directional light. Just gonna rotate this around, pull this up. Just tilt this down a little bit. I'll turn IPR on again. I don't want any of the light to brighten the screen right side of the plane, so pull this up a little bit. So that's looking a little bit too bright, so I'll go ahead and just drop that down to maybe 0.5. And if we compare this on, off, on, I think that's going to help our composite just a little bit. All right, I don't think there was anything else that we needed to fix. Let's go ahead and just make sure this is set up properly again. Version label, we need to update that to be 3. For now, we're going to still leave the max render time pretty low and just go ahead and make sure that we are updating everything that we need to. So in this case, we did change the camera, so all of our layers have to be re-rendered. If we were only making changes to, let's say, the plane, then we'd only have to re-render the plane. All right, so while we're waiting for that new render to finish, we can go ahead and start setting up our color correction and doing some other adjustments as well. So the very first thing that I want to do is some color correction. So I'm going to select this top layer up here, right click at the bottom, go to new adjustment layer, type in color correction. And I mentioned earlier that in V-Ray, there was a way to transfer the color information from the frame buffer into After Effects. I want to show that really fast here. I'll go back to an angle like this. Do a proper render. I'll turn on my image adjustments, and we had this curves effect on here, which is making everything a bit brighter. We also have things like the white balance, which will be color temperature. We can make the image warmer. So let's say I was really pleased with the color of this, and I wanted to save this exact color correction, and I wanted to use this same color correction inside of After Effects. You go up here to globals, click save. We'll just save this in comps. And we'll call this plane version 3, and we're looking for a LUT file. So in After Effects, you can add an effect called Apply Color LUT. And what this does, it is a lookup table, which will use the same values and color correction in V-Ray and across other platforms as well. It is a common format for transferring color information. Quite often clients will send you this if they have a color that they are happy with and they want all the artists to be using the exact color correction. So that is how you apply a LUT. I'm not actually going to use one in this case. I'm going to do my color correction manually. I'm going to just turn this off and add a curves effect. So with curves, what I want to do here is I want to make the highlights and midtones just a bit brighter, and then I'm going to darken the shadows to add a bit more contrast. Something more like this. I'm going to go into the red channel and pull out a little bit of red from the shadows. Then I'm going to allow the reds and the highlights to creep back into their original values, which is this straight line here. So just toggling between this, we've made the clouds a little bit more blue. We pulled out some of that red. We've added a little bit more contrast. Next, I'm going to add a Lumetri color effect. Now the Lumetri color gives us a lot of adjustments all in one effect, which is nice, and it is the only way inside of After Effects to change the color temperature without using a photo filter. So I'm going to turn on high dynamic range, and then in the temperature gauge we can just increase the temperature to a value of around 90, and make it look a little bit warmer, like it's sunset. Now unfortunately these values are not in Kelvin, which normally color temperature is in Kelvin, but the higher the number, the warmer the image in this case. We also have a lot of options for highlights and shadows. So for example, if we wanted to boost the shadows a little bit, because they are looking slightly dark, we could do a value of around 30. Now all of these adjustments you can use in curves, but it gets a little bit more complicated. So it is nice sometimes to be able to have just highlights or just shadow control. Next, we can also add some contrast here without having to use an additional curves. Maybe something at around 40 would be a good value. Now, one thing that we do have to be careful with when adding contrast and brightness especially is clipping. Now, clipping is when the value of a pixel exceeds the working space. So in this case, this is going beyond 8-bit and my monitor can no longer display these values properly. I'm just using a standard 8-bit monitor, and any value up here, these are floating point values. So 1 represents the limit of an 8-bit working space. So any value that goes beyond 1 means that the value cannot be displayed properly, and there's no subtle gradient between higher level values. Anything at 1, that's the highest it can go. So if there's pixels that are even brighter than that, it's just going to stop at 1. If I were to add another curves effect here to really extenuate this effect, you'll notice a really harsh line that appears. So this looks quite poor. It's something that you always want to avoid. We're going to just delete this curves. That was just as an example. and we're going to either lower our brightness of the curves, or we can use another effect called the HDR highlight compression. So the HDR highlight compression is a way of tone mapping high dynamic range values to low dynamic range values, or HDR to LDR. So in this case, what it does, it tries to make sure there's nothing that's going to clip, which it does, but it makes the image look very gray. There are tone mappers that work a lot better than this, but if we lock this off at maybe a value of around 30, I might just lower this brightness of the curves a little bit here. And you want to make sure there's no values getting above 1. So this looks pretty good now. We go into full resolution here, then have a look at these pilot's visors. You can see there's some highlights on them that are clipping. They're getting really, really bright. So because we have this refraction pass on a separate layer, we don't need to fix our overall color correction to simply fix these pixels. Instead, what we can do is go down to our refraction layer. We can solo this layer and apply an HDR highlight compression on it. This is going to be much dimmer. We can go back. So underneath our color correction, we can add an additional adjustment layer and call this vignette. Places underneath our color correction. And there is an effect called vignette. Just drag this on. And for now, we'll just leave the default values. Basically, it's just going to help pull our eye into the shot a little bit more. One other thing that I'm noticing here with the contrast of the intakes, they're looking very, very dark. So if we mouse over these intakes, we're getting values of 0, 0, 0 in the upper right-hand corner. It's not just bright values that can clip, it's also dark values, and here we're definitely getting clipping. So let's go back to our color correction layer, and on this curves effect, we'll zoom in on our curves, pull this up very slightly. You do have to be careful with it, don't go up too high. So we're gonna zoom in a little bit more here, just lift this up very slightly. Then we can zoom back out. So these values are no longer clipped. So the next thing we're going to do is make the exhaust. So we already have a matte for the exhaust, which is fine. I'm going to rename this layer to be exhaust matte. And underneath the exhaust matte, we're going to grab an adjustment layer. Let's call this exhaust. Now on the exhaust layer, we're going to change the track matte to be alpha. Exhaust is going to disappear, but that's just because we're using a track matte and there's nothing on this adjustment layer yet. To make this show up, we're just going to grab a curves effect and then just darken down the value. Something around there will be good. We can also add some heat distortion with a turbulent displace effect. You can set the amount to be 100 and the size to be 5, flexity maybe around 3. And you'll notice that it is kind of wobbling the clouds a little bit. Hold down Alt and click on the stopwatch next to evolution, then type in time multiplied by 1000. So this is going to allow it to constantly wobble. This looks really, really strong right now. Don't worry, it'll look okay in a moment. We can either adjust the curves values, or we can go and click T and then just lower the opacity. So we're gonna just increase these curves a little bit, make it not quite so dark. We could also add a fractal noise pattern over the top of this. We can change the blending mode to be multiplied. The noise type, we could say dynamic. Go into the transform and then just reduce the scale quite a bit. And we can also do the same thing with evolution. Type in time, asterisk, and then maybe something like 2000. Because this does not track with the plane, it's just kind of everywhere over the entire comp. We want it to move around quite a bit. And then we could even lower the opacity of this so it's not quite so strong. We want it to be fairly subtle. We just want an essence of it being there. I think this will look pretty good. We'll have to just see it rendered before I can make those judgments. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to stick around for the next part of this tutorial where we continue compositing this shot. Alright guys, so if you learned something, drop a like. If you have any questions, post a comment. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.